Okay, I see we're pretty much at a critical mass, so let me start. Welcome, everybody. I'm Ken Stern. I'm the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. Um, I'm delighted that you're here with us and with James Waller, who's an old friend and colleague and somebody who I admire greatly, who's going to talk to us about the risk of mass violence in the aftermath of the recent election. I'm sure all of us have been attuned to um, the problems in terms of the different buckets of people who have totally different perceptions of what the election was about and what it where we may be going in January 20th. And Jim has a long focused attention on risks of mass violence, the connection with the strength of democracy and so forth. So I'm very delighted that he's going to speak with us today. What we're going to do is after Jim gives a presentation, we're going to have a Q&A, and I encourage you to populate the Q&A button. You could do it while Jim is speaking. You can certainly do it afterwards as well. I'll remind you, and then I will curate the questions and pose them to him. We're going to finish up in an hour. So let me introduce Jim Waller. Dr. James Waller is the inaugural Cohen Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College in New Hampshire. It's offers the only undergraduate major in Holocaust and Genocide Studies in the United States. Waller is a widely recognized scholar in the field of Holocaust and Genocide Studies and has held visiting research professorships at universities that are too numerous to list. In the policymaking area, Waller is also regularly involved in his role as director of the academic programs with the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, as the curriculum developer and lead instructor for the Raphael Lemkin Seminars for Genocide Prevention. In addition to 5 books, Waller has published 29 articles in peer-reviewed professional journals, contributed 20 chapters in edited books. His research on perpetrators of genocide, published as Becoming Evil: How Ordinary People Commit Genocide and Mass Killings, was praised by Publishers Weekly for, quote, clearly and effectively synthesizing a wide range of studies to develop an original and persuasive model of the process by which people can become evil. Waller's 4th book, Confronting Evil, Engaging Our Responsibility to Prevent Genocide, has been hailed as, quote, required reading for all those who seek to understand and avert these atrocities in the future, and as, quote, a well-written, immensely valuable contribution to the field of genocide studies. His 5th book, A Troubled Sleep, Risk and Resilience in Contemporary Northern Ireland, is scheduled for release in 2021. He also is the author of an article, which I continue to cite, even though I think Jim wrote it probably 15 years ago for the Journal of Hate Studies, on what we can learn from evolutionary psychology as we understand hate. So I welcome you, and the floor is yours. I'm going to shut off my video. And thank you, Jim, for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you very much for the welcome. Good to be with you again, Ken. It's good to have known you over the years and see how our work continues to coincide. And thank you very much for the invitation to be back here with Bard, although not in person, at least be able to be here virtually. And thanks everyone for your interest today as well. I'm going to share my screen with you. I have a brief PowerPoint presentation. I'm hoping everyone can see that. Ken, are you able to tell me if it's okay?
It looks fine, Jim.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. So what I want to talk about today are issues of escalating risk of mass violence in the US. This comes from a paper I did and published recently with the Stanley Center for Peace and Security that came out the week before the election. And I want to start by using this metaphor, these 2 competing metaphors, to give us an introduction to how we think about understanding risk of mass violence, because much of what I do in my field in terms of genocide and atrocity prevention has to do with turning the lens of understanding the risk of mass violence to countries elsewhere around the world. In 2017, I first wrote a risk assessment for the US, and so in many ways, this piece I just published with the Stanley Center was an update on that risk assessment. On the left here, you see the black swan, which is an incredibly unique occurrence. It's unpredictable, it's hard to spot, it's incredibly surprising. And very often in the past, when people have talked about outbreaks of mass violence, they've tended to focus on it through this black swan metaphor of, we didn't see it coming. We can't believe it happened. We had no warning signs. We had no indicators. We had no triggers. It just caught us all by surprise. I think the much better metaphor for understanding the risk of mass violence is on the right-hand side. That's the gray rhino. We see it coming. It's not subtle. It's not hidden. It shouldn't be surprising. It's right there in front of us. And if we simply open our eyes, we can get a pretty clear assessment of the risk of mass violence in any society or any country in the world. And I think this has really been one of the great contributions of the field of genocide studies over the past couple of decades, is helping us unpack that understanding of what risk of mass violence looks like. And to give us a visual image of this, I'll start with this. Ken mentioned my next book coming out in March has to do with Northern Ireland. I spent time there as a visiting research professor at Queen's University in Belfast. And this is a bonfire. Northern Ireland has a huge, long tradition of bonfires. This one is going to be lit on the night of July 11th. This is in a Protestant section of Belfast. And you can see the enormity of this bonfire. These things take months to build. These are pallets of wood just piled on top of each other. Here you see midway up the bonfire some images of Catholic or nationalist politicians. You see the Union Jack flying on top. But when I think of understanding risk of assessing mass violence, this is to me what we're looking at. We're wanting to know, what is the stack of wood? If we think of this wood as risk, what is the stack of wood in a given country? How high is this risk? How volatile is the potential for this risk if it's accelerated, if gasoline is thrown on it, if it's triggered, if a flame is thrown on it? And as we see in Belfast, when these bonfires are lit, they're just huge, huge events. And here you see one in the neighborhood, and police come and they douse, firemen come and fire personnel, and they douse the houses surrounding the bonfire with the water so the houses don't get caught on fire. But in a way, this is what we're talking about today, of understanding the risk of mass violence is, how can we identify the wood? How can we identify how big the stacks of wood are? And what do we worry about that would accelerate or trigger that wood into becoming a flashpoint of violence, as you see here in this bonfire? So a large part of what I've done over the past several years is work on understanding risk assessment for mass violence and looking for the broad similarities and patterns that we see across the world, that we have quantitative evidence for, that escalate the risk of mass violence. And as I've done that research over the years, I've grouped this data into 4 categories. One related to governance, another related to memory, particularly memory of conflict history, yet another related to economic conditions, and a final one related to social fragmentation. So when the Stanley Center asked me to turn my attention to risk assessment in the US, these were the 4 categories I worked from, and these are the 4 categories I want to share with you just briefly. We're not going to go through these point by point, but just so you have a sense of what the data tells us, in terms of governance, we have these 5 key indicators that help us assess risk of escalation and possibility of mass violence related to type of regime, how legitimate the state is seen by its population, how strong or weak are state structures, the degree of identity-based polar factionalism in government, and then the degree to which there's systematic state-led discrimination. For each of these indicators, we can come up with a wide range of quantitative data and qualitative data that give us a sense of how countries stand in terms of risk related to governance. I think the key risk issue to think about it more broadly here has to do with democratic institutions. To what degree are democratic institutions strong and stable and flourishing? And the unfortunate news over the past decade particularly is that we've seen a global erosion of democratic norms. Here you see in this graphic from Freedom House, we see ways in which term limits for executives have been revised all over the world. Particularly, we're seeing this throughout Central Africa. Constitutional limits on presidential power being removed so that people in power remain in power for lifetime appointments. We see restrictions on freedom of expression. We see issues with elections and electoral processes. I can't share the country, but a couple of years ago, I was part of a team monitoring an election in a country that was just starting to work with democratic institutions, democratic systems. And when the election was over, I remember a government official coming to our meeting with just excitement on his face. And he was so happy and he was so pleased because the election had been incredibly successful. And his data point, his indicator for that was 135% of the population had voted. I can't remember which one of us had the courage to break his heart and say, it's not a good thing when 135% of the population votes. You've had some problems, you've had some issues with fraudulent voting. So we've seen this global erosion of democratic norms for the past decade, and certainly it has raised concern. Because we've seen such a global erosion, we've also been able to identify a bit of the process of how this democratic deconsolidation or democratic backsliding occurs. And we've seen leaders who create a nationalistic mythic past and shape memory and shape history in ways that suit their purposes. The division of populations into us and them. We've seen this in Hungary, we've seen it in Poland, we've seen it to a large degree in the US. An anti-intellectualism that's part of this democratic backsliding that removes a capacity for reasoned debate, that places intellectualism, particularly scientific insights, into question, the maximizing of partisan advantage and polarization, and a tendency to elevate the people's will over constitutional checks and balances. So I think the sad state of democracy around the world is that we've seen this erosion, this backsliding enough that we're actually able to identify some of the processes that lead to it. Evan Osnos in December of 2016, I think, asked this very important question about what is that precise moment in the life of a country when tyranny takes hold? And he says it rarely happens in an instant. It arrives like twilight, and at first the eyes adjust. And I think this is a helpful way of us understanding this democratic backsliding. It doesn't happen overnight. It's like you're sitting outside on a sunny day and you're reading and you have plenty of light to do so. And as the sun goes down, as twilight comes, your eyes adjust and adjust and adjust until the point that it's dark and you simply can't read any longer. So I think one of the things we worry about with democratic backsliding around the world is that it is a long, sustained, slow process. And at many points in the process, we think it's not worth saying anything. It's not worth worrying about because it's not that big of a deal. But it happens enough times that eventually does become a big deal. We certainly have seen some degree of democratic backsliding in the US. The Economist Intelligence Unit publishes a yearly democracy index. For the first time in 2017, the US was classified as a flawed democracy. It was classified that way again in 2018, 2019, and likely will be as well in 2020. But if you look globally, you see the degree to which democracy has been in decline over the past decade or so. And again, for the first time in 2017, the US was part of that decline and now being labeled a flawed democracy. So in the paper I did for the Stanley Center, my conclusion in looking at the US in terms of governance was this, that there has certainly been a disintegration of trust and faith in US democratic institutions. Actually, when we can track this decline, we can track this disintegration. This certainly was there before the Trump administration. We have a wide range of survey data indicating that for the past several decades, the degree of trust and faith in our democratic institutions in the US has been on a pretty steady decline. It certainly accelerated considerably under the Trump administration. And now in the days after the election, it continues to accelerate. I think most people recognize that the results of the election are in. We know who the president-elect is going to be, but the continued attacks on the validity of the electoral system, the validity of our voting system, the heart of our very constitutional democracy, those attacks, even though they're not going to be successful in changing the results, are going to be successful in further disintegrating the trust and faith that we have in our own democratic institutions. So one of the things I argue in the paper is that regardless of who won the election, there's a mountain of work to be done to restore the trust and faith in the democratic institutions that, again, has been eroding for decades. I think the second feature or factor I'd look at in terms of assessing risk has to do with memory, and particularly how a country deals with a troubled past. And when we see countries that have not dealt with a troubled past through pursuits of truth, through pursuits of justice, through attempts at memory and accurate historical understanding, we know that that leaves a country at risk for their future. And I think in the US, our issues having to do with memory and conflict history have to do with recognition that we're a country founded on the twin evils of genocide and slavery. We're a country founded on the extermination of one people for the gaining of land for colonizers, and then the enslavement of another people for an economic expropriation that is the foundation. Both of those things, the land taken from one people, the economic development taken from the slavery, the profit of slavery from another people, those things are foundational to the success of our country still today in many regards. So coming to grips with the reality of that history of conflict, the history of tension in our country, is something that we really haven't done well. We haven't dealt well with that troubled past. I'm a child of the South, born and raised in the South in the US. And I still remember when I went to college in Kentucky and took my first history course, and the professor kept referring to the Civil War. I kept looking around me at other students in the class because I'd never heard of this thing before. And then at some point in the lecture, I realized he was talking about what I had been taught was the War of Northern Aggression. And that is a perfect illustration of how a contested past becomes even more contested by the ways we remember it, the ways we teach it, the ways in which we commemorate it. I think one of the things of concern now for us is the way in which the digital world in which we live continues to shape memory. The Oxford Internet Institute last year did a report, as you see here, where they said social media, which we once thought of was a great force for freedom and democracy, has come under increasing scrutiny for the way it amplifies disinformation, incites violence, and again, lower levels of trust in media and democratic institutions. I think the Center at Bard is so important because much of how hate is being transmitted today is it's being transmitted through the digital shaping of hate and its impact on memory and the amplification of hate in the ways in which it can incite violence as well. So I think it's important as we think about risk assessment to understand the impact of the past on our present, and especially the impact of a contested past and a conflicted past and how it leaves us vulnerable to violence today. When I talk about memory and risk assessment, this is what I speak about is things that are purposefully blind to the tensions, violence, trauma, grievances, and egregious violations of the past and its direct impact on the present. For people like me who work in risk assessment, the past is not of interest to us simply because it's the past. The past is of interest to us directly because of its impact on the present and how that past is taught, how it's remembered, how it's understood, how it's processed is crucial to understanding how it impacts the risk of violence in our world today. The third risk assessment category I'd look at has to do with economic conditions. And here you see some of the indicators for that in terms of economic development, discrimination, deterioration, and so on. I think globally, we have seen the global impact of the reality of this hit with the implications of COVID-19. It has led and will continue to lead for quite some time to a significant global recession, and in many countries in the world, a depression. We've seen escalations both in our country and obviously around the world in unemployment, particularly among young men in many countries where young men struggle to find employment. And often, for instance, in many countries in Central Africa, elect to go into paramilitaries for criminal activity or violent activity. We've seen an increase in just economic desperation, and the access to social services and healthcare that always are difficult to get for many people in many countries now have a pronounced inequality to them. As I think about these things in the US, again, we have longstanding issues of economic discrimination going back to the very founding of our country. And the pandemic is going to escalate the risk of mass violence because of those longstanding issues of economic discrimination, the way that wealth is transmitted generationally, the way that poverty is transmitted generationally. And as I say here, the difficulty for this in terms of violence issues is that deprived groups can resort to violence to try to redress some of these inequalities, or sometimes privileged groups can mobilize with violence to try to preserve their privilege as well. And then the final risk assessment category of factors I look at, which I think in many ways is the most important, has to do with social fragmentation. When a society has a unified purpose, it has strong and good intergroup relations, we describe it as a society that has social cohesion. But the opposite of that, with a society torn apart by social divisions, is one that we call social fragmentation. And the key part of social divisions within a fragmented society has to do with issues of social identity. And these are what scholars talk about as characteristics of a deeply divided society. That in a deeply divided society, social identity is central. In other words, what matters is not the similarities that we share in terms of our social identity, but what matters are the differences. And those differences can manifest themselves along a wide spectrum, a wide variety of things having to do with issues of social identity: class, caste, social hierarchy, faith communities, sectarian divides can be prominent, language, race, ethnic, national cleavages, a wide range of other binary divisions. So unfortunately, there are a lot of ways in which a society that's suffering from social fragmentation can fall into these type of deep divisions where what matters are not the things that bind us together, but the things that make us different. And where we really worry about this in a deeply divided society is when these things become polarized, when social identity becomes polarized, when there's a deep, long history of violence, deep political divisions that often lead to differences in quality of life, communities of fear and isolation. All of these things come into play in deeply divided societies. And in many ways, what I focused on in the paper, although we have many forms of deep division in the US, is I focused on issues of racial division and political division. And those issues, which again, have always been here. One of the things I wanted to be careful to do in the paper, and I'm still careful to do, is to say that the factors that we're assessing here in terms of risk were not created when President Trump stepped into the Oval Office. These things have been here long before Trump. They're going to be here long after Trump. He certainly has, and his administration has, exacerbated many of these deep divisions and certainly exacerbated much of the erosion of the faith we see in US democratic institutions. But we're talking about structural long-term problems that have been here through Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, and are going to continue to be here. There's nothing about President-elect Biden's move into the Oval Office that is going to magically make any of these risk factors disappear. And you and I see what it's like to live in these communities of fear, communities of isolation. We very seldom speak to people who have different political opinions than we do. We recognize the deep racial divisions that still find their way into our front page news. We're coming off a summer of racial unrest that, again, did not start this summer. It's been there for our history. And it comes in these fits and starts and these bursts. And we see it over the course of this summer of unrest. So I think for me, really the question having to do with social fragmentation is the concern that comes about when groups are seen not just as different from another group, not just as incompatible with another group, but when groups are seen as an intractable existential threat to each other. In other words, when the divisions are so deep that the other group is seen not just a group that is different from me, but as a group that is a threat to the existence of my own group. And I think one of the things I found most concerning about what I see as this pattern of escalating risk is this concept of existential threat. That is now not simply differences of opinion, but it becomes differences that really, for many people, make them feel like the presence of that group is a threat to my existence in some way. And what we've seen historically is when we have that sense of fear and isolation and threat in a society, that this is one of the precursors we see for when genocide happens, because one group comes to power and says, now I finally have a chance to deal with this existential threat legally, politically, socially, economically, or perhaps even in the form of their own existence. So one of my concerns is, how long can a society like ours live with these deep social, political, racial divisions that we've had? How long are we able to maintain that tension in which we live and that tension in which we work? So I'll conclude with this question and then get to questions and comments that you have as well. In 2017, when I first wrote the risk assessment that appeared, I think it was published by the Center for International Law and Development, risk assessment in the US, one of the questions I raised was simply this: what would we say if we saw this risk profile in another country? In other words, if all the things we just talked about in terms of governance, memory, economic conditions, and social fragmentation in the US, if we weren't talking about the US, but we saw all of those factors, that same risk profile in a Latin American country, an African country, an Eastern European country, what would we say if we saw it there? One of the things I've argued in the paper is, I think we'd say in one voice, that's risk. It's escalating. There's danger there. Things aren't going well there. With a president who refuses to concede power, things aren't going well there. With the security sector and security forces who kill unarmed Black men and women, things aren't going well there. It looks volatile. It looks like the risk is stacked. If we were to say that about another country, there's no exceptionalism that protects us from recognizing that in our own country as well. So one of the things I've argued, and this is a conclusion to the paper, is that if risk analysts were noting these same trends anywhere else in the world, the approaching storm would be clear and alarms would be raised by a wide range of government, non-governmental forces. And I know that often people hear or read things I've written in this area and they see it as alarmist. I don't think there's anything alarmist about it whatsoever. There has to be a recognition of the reality in which the United States finds itself. And alarms are relevant. Alarms are appropriate at this time. I've not argued that we're a failed state or a failing state. We are, though, a fragile state, and we are a flailing state. We're certainly closer to a breakdown than a breakthrough. And again, nothing magical about January 20th is going to change that. For all of us, there is still a mountain of hard work to do to restore the faith in governance, to restore memory of the contested memories we've talked about, to restore economic equality, and to somehow start to bring about some sense of social cohesion. If we can't do those things and we keep trending in this direction we've been trending, again, I think we're much closer to a breakdown than a breakthrough. I told Ken I would speak for 30 minutes. I think I've spoken for 27, so that's good. And now I have a chance to get some questions and comments from you as well. So thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you so much, Jim. I really appreciate that. Just very deeply educating presentation. It's important for people to hopefully read your paper too at some point and to see more detail. But you gave a very good synopsis of it. These are structural problems that long precede the current moment, but the current moment is exacerbating them as well. So I encourage people to put questions in the Q&A. I have some of my own, but I'm going to prioritize the ones that are coming in. And what I'm going to do is also turn off my video so that's not distracting, and you can just all watch Jim as he answers. So the first question is, if memory of past wrongs, you give the example of the War of Northern Aggression versus the Civil War, can be and has been a source of future violence, how can the false perceived wrong of the election of 2020, having been stolen, be eliminated or deflected as a source of future violence in the US?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it is incumbent on all of us, but particularly upon media, upon educators, upon scholars, to make sure that we continue to lay the groundwork for the reality of what is unfolded. In other words, one of the things, and I talked about this with the digital shaping of memory, is social media transmits information so quickly now that fallacies and falsehood, once they're disseminated, they start to take on their own life. And it's difficult to pull them back from the edge once they've started to take on that life. So I think it's more important than ever that we stay as close to the facts of things as we possibly can, that journalists particularly adhere to the quality guidelines that ethics of journalism journalists have set up, that educators do the same. I mean, this is, we've not had a time in history, and in large part this goes to social media, where we've had to so quickly respond to fallacies and falsehoods that are disseminated, because again, they so quickly gain a life of their own, that I think to set back and let them be propagated has been part of the problem. That we've had some hesitancy to call a lie, and some hesitancy to be as careful as we need to be about truth and precision.
Thank you. So next question is, there's evidence that social belongingness and community involvement are declining in the US generally. Do you think we can disentangle that from the decline in trust in democratic institutions? If not, how do you imagine we'd address that aspect of withdrawal from or disintegration of social cohesion?
No, I think you're exactly right. There's wide range of survey data evidence that social belongingness has been decreasing over the past couple of decades. And with that, I think that sense of social belongingness decreasing, social isolation increasing, social fragmentation increasing, all of those things tend to pull us away from democratic institutions. I mean, the more we become isolated, whether it is isolated from public libraries, isolated from public conversation, isolated from local government, isolated from state government, from federal government, all those senses of isolation make democratic institutions more and more difficult to function, I think, on a daily level. And I see it just from having taught college for 35 years. I have never in the past decade, I've just never seen students as disengaged from the political process in the sense of we're not sure how to have an impact on the political process. It feels far away from us. It feels like our vote doesn't matter. It feels like our voice doesn't matter. And I think one of the concerning things for me, and this threaded its way throughout the paper, is the impact of the pandemic on this. The pandemic makes us more narcissistic. It makes us more self-focused. We are protecting ourselves. We're protecting people close to us, others, anyone outside of our immediate family in most cases is now seen as a threat. Others are a risk that we have to avoid. And so coming out of the pandemic, there's going to be a coming back to society, coming back to community that I think we certainly are going to have to be much more intentional about. I think as we are more intentional about those things that bring social cohesion, I think that's one part of the process that will start to restore some of the strength of our democratic institutions.
Thank you. The next question is, how do the factors of memory and economics affect the likelihood of mass violence when it is the historically dominant and economically successful group that is the source of potential violence?
Yeah, I think that the major issues with memory and economic conditions are these. One is how memory is used by people in power, and part of that is how memory is used to continue to foster grievances. So for instance, in the former Yugoslavia, and today in Bosnia and Herzegovina, children learn history from 3 different textbooks. If you're Bosniak, you learn history from a Bosniak textbook, Croat from a Croat textbook, Serb from a Serb textbook. Each of those present the war of 1992 to 1995, those wars, in ways that tend to foster and just keep inculcating these grievances. The sense that we lost, the sense that we got screwed. And in this way, memory is not a healer, it's not anything cohesive, but memory is used in very divisive ways that sow the seeds for future conflict. And I think in terms of economic conditions, what the data tells us is that it's not about poverty per se. So it's not the issue that the poorer a country is, the more at risk for violence it is. The issue is economic disparities and unequal economic distributions, that when money and the power that goes with it are in the hands of a few, those are the things that increase the levels of risk within a given society. So I think both memory and economic conditions certainly have their own role to play in increasing risk of mass violence. Neither necessarily trigger it, but we're talking again about the long-term structural things that increase risk and also incapacitate resilience.
Great, thank you. Here's another question is, how do you approach the risk assessment for social fragmentation without placing and this is parenthetically, perceived existential crisis on equal footing? For example, I believe Black Americans are right to believe that their existence is a threat with white supremacists and white nationalists in power. However, I do not think that should be placed on an equal field with white nationalists viewing Black Americans as an existential threat to living and thriving in this country.
No, I understand the intent of the question, and I agree with the question completely. From an objective, outside perspective, there's no equivalence between those two whatsoever. One is one group, Black Americans, absolutely under much more existential threat than are white nationalists. I think that is the reality. What matters for risk, though, is perceived reality. You and I could talk till we're blue in the face that white nationalists are not under the same risk existentially as Black Americans in the US. For white nationalists, I mean, those arguments fall on deaf ears. If the reality they perceive is we are under risk, Black Americans get everything, they have affirmative action, they have this, they have that, and they're trying to eradicate our culture and our white history, the perception is what matters. It is not the objective reality, it's the perception of reality. I'll draw this analogy. I work with perpetrator behavior in genocide studies. In the Holocaust, the objective reality is we don't have a single case of a would-be perpetrator that we've documented saying, I don't want to kill, and then themselves being killed. They were sent elsewhere, they were given other death duties, they were reassigned, but we don't have a single case of a would-be killer choosing not to kill and then themselves being killed. The perceived reality, though, of the killers in the Holocaust was, if I don't kill, I may myself be killed. It doesn't excuse their behavior, but it tells us that their perception of reality shaped their behavior. I think in the same way, obviously the existential threats aren't equivalent in the US, but for an aggrieved group, they will develop a perception of reality that absolutely justifies their belief that they are the victims, that they're the ones who are most likely to be under existential threat.
Thank you, Jim. Next question is, social media has encouraged an illusion that we don't need democratic institutions and their authority to sustain us. Yet this illusion has led to chaos as all the individual voices are creating noise. That is why we are now seeking like-minded groups for our survival, because we really don't want to be alone. That comforts us, and we are too tired to hear other voices. Is that right?
I think I do think there's a fatigue that has, and the Oxford Internet Institute spoke of this in their 2019 report, a fatigue that social media has placed on us, that there is so much information coming so rapidly from so many sources that the easiest thing to do, as the questioner said, is to lock in on what we already believe and the people who already share that belief. Even if just we lock in on that area, we're still getting inundated with a ton of information. But to try and filter through all of the information coming through today on social media and all the information we have access to on the internet and other places, it really does lead to a substantial fatigue. And I do think the spirit of the question is spot on, in the sense that in the face of the fatigue, the easiest thing for us to do is just to shelter down with the people who believe like us, to read the articles, the magazines, the newspapers who are slanted toward us, to watch the documentaries that support what we already believe, to expose ourselves to the things we don't believe, to people who may disagree. It's absolutely a fatiguing thing to do. And right now, again, I'll connect back to the pandemic. For most of us, we just don't have the bandwidth to be able to do that. And we have become so self-obsessed that we just search for the easiest route. And the easiest route is always people who think like us, our own group. In the article, I talk about the polarized media diets that we consume. And again, we've never had a point in recent history where we are consuming such polarized media diets, and the media feeds on that. They know who to direct it to, and we consume it. So that's what I mean in the conclusion when I say there's a lot of hard work to be done. It's not hard work just by politicians. It's hard work by us to see if there are ways that we can push ourselves out of the comfort of just talking to and being with people who agree with us, to bring back some sense of dialogue, some sense of conversation.
Thank you, Jim. Building on your mention of the pandemic, the next question is, what do you see to be the potential centripetal forces that can work against the lack of cohesion and increased fragmentation? Can the pandemic's ultimate end be an opportunity for healing and coming together, and what might that look like?
That's a great question. I have focused on the impact of the pandemic and increasing risk. This question pushes us to think about, could the pandemic in the long run be something that unifies, it brings us together? Because certainly it's not a respecter of persons, and we've seen that already. I think I think that answer is yet to be given, because part of it, and I just read a piece earlier today expressing this concern that with all the great news about the receipt of possible vaccines, what will the distribution of those be like? And already there are groups of people of color in the US recognizing the reality of what their lived experience has been historically, which is we won't be the first to get them. We'll be among the last to get them. People of lower socioeconomic status expressing the same concern. So I think the degree to which the pandemic might have some type of unifying influence is probably going to be tied very closely to how we handle something as complex as the distribution of vaccines, how we, again, understand people who may choose not to take it, and all the ways in which the anti-intellectualism of the past several years is going to come into play there. So I appreciate the hopeful intent of the question, that maybe it would have a unifying influence at some point. But I think, again, not to be alarmist, you can certainly think of ways it will continue to have a fairly divisive influence.
Thank you, Jim. The next question is historical and comparative. If I have worked at the USIS in Brazil during the 1980s, it had a program to bring, quote, up and coming young professionals to the US to learn about the US experience, most especially on race relations. The result of it, as I see it after more than 30 years later, is that race relations in Brazil became worse as Brazilians tried to imitate the US ethnic leaderships. What do you say about the role of the US?
I would say, specifically in terms of race relations, I think it's, it would be very difficult for the US to paint itself as a role model in that regard. I mean, we haven't, issues of reparations, for instance, that many other countries have taken on with respect to minorities who have suffered histories of persecution, and in some cases of extermination. The reparation discussion has never really taken hold here in the US. I think how we understand race through education has been difficult, certainly not a model for the rest of the world. I think we think of Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision requiring desegregation of America's public schools. I think there's a wealth of data indicating that our public schools today are more segregated in many cases than they were before the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, because people who have the privilege to do so and the wealth to do so have pulled their children out and taken them to private schools or found other ways to avoid desegregated schools. So I think this is one of the challenges. I work often with countries and governments around the world, and this is one of the challenges that I think those of us in the US have to face is, in many of these regards, particularly with race relations, we're not the model, that we have much more to learn from other societies around the world than we have to teach. And that goes against the grain of this, deep US exceptionalism that we're trained to have. And I work with US government officials, and I think the most effective ones are ones who recognize they have more to learn from the world than they have to teach the world. And unfortunately, they also tend to be among the fewest in the US civil service.
Thank you, Jim. The next question is sort of the flip of that. Wouldn't you say that the risk, parenthetically, social fragmentation in particular, is increasing in other countries such as Western Europe, France, Germany, et cetera, as well? And if yes, is there a potential cross effect of this increase? In other words, things happening abroad having an impact on the situation in the United States?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Social fragmentation is increasing across the world. We have a toxic tribalism, across the globe that is also tied, I think, to this global erosion of democracy. All these factors we've talked about, memory, conflict history, economic conditions, social fragmentation, these are what we call cross-cutting issues. I presented them in boxes, but they don't live in boxes. They all intersect and interface with each other. And social fragmentation, I would say in the societies I work with through my work with the Auschwitz Institute, every society we work in is having issues to some degree of social fragmentation, whether it's political, racial, ethnic, gender divides, whatever it is, they're having those issues of social fragmentation. And, you know, this is a social identity question. We have come to define ourselves not just by who we are, but by who we're not. And really the prevailing question, I think, around the world has been this question of who are we not? That's what it's become. It's not just who I am, what group I'm a part of, but most importantly, who I'm not. And I think we see that impacting society after society after society. And in many ways, you know, we work often with the UN Office for the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. And they'll say, I think this is a tad simplistic, but I understand the spirit of it, that at the heart of it, the problem of genocide is a problem of an inability to manage diversity. In other words, an inability to manage social fragmentation, an inability to manage identity. And if you were to ask me what's the greatest challenge facing us in what's left of the 21st century, it's a challenge of identity. How do we manage questions of who we are and questions of who we're not? And if we can't come to grips with those type of identity questions, the risk of mass violence, I think, continues to escalate across the world.
Thank you, Jim. We have a number of questions about social media and asking you to expand upon that a little bit more in terms of what you see as the role of social media, the threat of social media. And I wanted to tag on something to that general question for you. Is that I, a few years ago, decided that I would seek out opinions that were not in my sort of bucket. I would watch a lot of Fox News and see things from not in my usual, area where I share opinions with people. And there was a pushback from friends. How could you do that? How could you watch Fox News and so forth? I was sharing that concern about social media with some other folks and found a study that basically tried to encourage people, gave them some financial reward for a month to be open to get bots from people that have a different point of view. And what it ended up doing, rather than making them more empathetic or more open-minded, it actually made them more hateful, got them further into their worlds. So how do you understand, talk a little bit more about the role of social media, and what would you do to try to ameliorate some of the problems?
Oh, those are good questions, Ken. I do think, I know Facebook and Twitter have obviously wrestled with how they understand hate speech, how they understand inaccurate political speech, how they understand possibly what could be genocidal speech or genocidal denial. So I think social media is in many ways having to figure out what role do they play as arbiters of truth and accuracy. In other words, are there things that are off limits because they're completely false, they're wrong, they're hateful, they're insightful? And then at what point, do that box of things that are off limits become so big that itself becomes a problem to some degree? I think what we have seen is what research suggests is when people expose themselves to ideas different from their own, that it doesn't necessarily lead to changes in attitudes as much as it almost leads to a self-reinforcing inoculation of attitudes. In other words, when I know what it is I disagree with and I hear that viewpoint, then it enables me to strengthen my own viewpoint. And I think that's a different way of understanding these type of conversations. In other words, a conversation, if it's simply about understanding them, so I know why I'm right and I can reinforce my rightness, that's a very different conversation than really sitting with someone to try and understand their perspective, not again so it increases the strength of your own position, but simply to try to have an empathic understanding of what this alternate position may be. And again, in some cases, I think, and this is what's tricky, certainly in the field of genocide studies, is those alternate positions they can't be recognized as valid. They can't be recognized as legitimate because they're so hateful and they're so destructive that we do eventually see what they lead to. So I think the question you raised, Ken, is something I can't answer in terms of what is the best way to engage this or what is the most healthy way to do it. I think the first step in the problem is just understanding the risk that come with it. And I think, it's been difficult for us to stay up with the speed of the technology. I remember years ago reading an article that, it was technology that changed the ways our brains worked. So when we had the telegraph, we started to think of our brains in some ways as machines that communicated internally like telegraphs. Then we had the telephone, and it gave us a new way of understanding how our minds worked. And then we had the computer, and that gave us yet another new way of understanding how our minds work. So understanding how our minds work always seems to lag behind the technology. And I think social media's challenge for us today is it's forcing us to rethink how our minds work. And that's something we don't do overnight, obviously.
Thank you, Jim. Let me just add one other question to you on top of that about QAnon, which is an interesting phenomenon. I read a piece the other day by somebody who was creating games and looking at the QAnon conspiracy theory. I presume most people know it, but it's basically that Trump is going to save the world, that kids are being stolen and they're being enslaved, and it's a Democratic plot. It's traditional anti-Semitic tropes, but are applied in a new way against Democrats and seeing Trump as a God figure saving everybody. The point of the article was that this is how people write games to engage people, and it's not necessarily here's the ideology that you have to subscribe to. Trump lost the election or whatever, but it's more of here are little pieces and clues, and we're going to be a community that gets together to further look for things that really reinforce our preconception. So that strikes me as something new and disconcerting, that it's a community of people thinking together about how they're going to solve this puzzle and making it much more engaging for them.
No, I think that is new to the degree that it's being presented as a game and a puzzle and engaging, but it's old as the hills in terms of this is what communities of like-minded people tend to do, is find things that reinforce their own beliefs. And in some ways that becomes its own game. I remember, Ken, I taught in Berlin, Germany in 1989, 1990. And I took one trip, a weekend trip out to a small town in Austria. And it was a Saturday, and I came into the small town, and it was a Catholic church, and people were pouring out of the Catholic church and carrying on a pedestal on their shoulders the mummified remains of a child. And it was an annual commemoration this particular church did for a child that had been killed a couple of centuries before in what they believed was a Jewish ritual ceremony, that this Christian child had been killed. Her blood had been taken for use in matzo balls and religious observance and ritual. And every year they brought out the mummified remains of this child to remind themselves of the dangers of Judaism and just to reinforce this anti-Semitism. And this is summer of 1990 that I would have seen this actually happen. So it's just 30 years ago. So I think that tendency for like-minded people to reinforce the most irrational, hateful, ridiculous beliefs that they have has always been here. I think social media, as you pointed out, can ratchets that up a notch in terms of bringing a game atmosphere to it, bringing a puzzle atmosphere to it, bringing a sense of community to people who probably, especially during the time of pandemic, do feel some degree sense of social isolation.
Thank you. And Jim, I'm going to ask you one final question. People have asked it different ways, but I'm going to rephrase it because it's, you know, the sort of what do we do about it question. If you had half an hour with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and they asked you, what should we do to reduce the risk of mass violence? What should we do to reduce the divide between us and them? What should we do to reduce hate? What would you tell them?
Well, I think this is where, to me, these 4 categories of risk are helpful, because I focus on them again because a large part of what I do in my work is risk assessment. I focus on the risk associated with the 4 categories. But the other side of the coin is that every category of risk also gives its own recommendations for how to build resilience. And that's really the question you're asking, Ken, is how do we build resilience? We can't fix it overnight. But in governance, what are the things we can do to make governance more resilient? What are the things we can do for memory, for economic conditions, for social fragmentation, and so on? And so I think the risk issues I've laid out all have their corresponding piece of resilience to it. I think we can think about governance that is inclusive, governance that tries to go beyond identity-based polar factionalism. I think we can think about economic conditions that are more inclusive. I certainly think we can think about ways in which memory can be more inclusive, and certainly ways in which how we define ourselves in social identity can be more inclusive. So I think there are policy prescriptions. When you understand, to me, what the most important thing is understanding where risk comes from. And that's where I put most of my effort. When you understand where risk comes from, then you start to understand the ways that resilience can be built to try to decrease that type of risk. And I think for me, sometimes what goes astray is people just wanting to build resilience in the way they think resilience should be built without really understanding what you're trying to be resilient against. What are the issues of risk that we have to be concerned with in the first place?
Anyway, thank you so much, Jim. Really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and expertise and giving us a lot to think about and actually a lot to do. So I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody else for attending. You will get an email tomorrow with a recording of this, and feel free to share it with others. And we're not going to reconvene again until after Thanksgiving. So I wanted to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving too. Anyway, thank you, Jim. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you all for the time.
Thanks, Jim. Take care. Bye-bye.